Out on the Montana Plateau, in the winter of 1875, the world had been erased by snow. It wasn't just cold. It was a deep, biting silence that buried everything under a blanket of white. The pines stood like ghosts, their branches heavy, and the last sliver of daylight was being swallowed whole by the ridge. In the middle of all that nothingness stood a cabin, Eleanor Carter's cabin. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress built of timber and grief. 6 years. 6 years since the war took her husband. 6 years since the fever took her daughter. After that, Eleanor stopped building a life and started building walls. Not just the pine logs of her cabin, but walls inside her heart, stacked high with routine and silence. She baked bread. She chopped wood. She dried herbs. She survived. Words were a currency she no longer traded in. And guess? They were a memory from another lifetime. So when the knock came, it wasn't just a sound. It was a violation. The fire hissed in the hearth, a lonely sound in a quiet room. Eleanor was stirring a pot, her mind 1,000 miles away, when the sharp, urgent rap echoed through the cabin. Knock, knock. It was desperate. She froze, spoon in midair. The wind howled outside, and for a moment, she thought she might have imagined it. Maybe it was just a branch, heavy with ice, cracking against the roof. But then it came again, harder this time. Bam, bam. This was no branch. This was a fist. Eleanor moved with the slow, deliberate calm of a woman who had already lost everything there was to lose. She feared very little, but she trusted even less. She lit a lantern, the flames sputtering to life, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She walked to the door, her boots making no sound on the worn floorboards. Through the small, frost-glazed window, she saw a shape, a silhouette hunched against the driving snow, clutching something to its chest. She hesitated for only a second. Then she unlatched the heavy wooden bar and pulled the door inward. The storm roared into the cabin like a beast, a vortex of ice and wind that made the fire gutter and shrink. A man staggered over the threshold, his face a ghostly white, his coat a solid sheet of ice. He was cradling a bundle wrapped in blankets, and from within it came a soft, pitiful whimper. He looked like a man at the absolute end of his rope. "My horse died," he gasped, his voice a raw, broken thing. "5 miles back, my son and I, we walked." His eyes, hollowed out by exhaustion, pleaded with her. "He's freezing. Please, just for one night." Eleanor's gaze dropped from the man's face to the bundle in his arms. It was a child, a little boy, limp and pale, his breath coming in fragile, misty puffs. Her face, a mask of hard-won indifference, didn't change. Her lips pressed into a thin, unforgiving line. This was a complication she did not need. This was a ghost from a past she had buried under 6 feet of snow and 6 years of silence. "My stove's small," she said, her voice flat, devoid of sympathy. "The floor is colder than the ground out there." The man didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just looked down at the child in his arms with a kind of profound, exhausted despair. It was the look of a man who had been beaten down by the world one too many times. "We've got nowhere else to go," he whispered, his shoulders slumping. She studied him then, really looked at him. He wasn't old, but the lines around his eyes spoke of a hard life. His hands were rough, but there was something else about them. Something clean. His coat, though frayed, was well made. He clutched the child with a desperate tenderness, the way a man holds the last precious thing he has left in the world. He was a man who knew what it was to lose. She knew that look all too well. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire winter, Eleanor stepped aside. "Come in." The man nodded once, a gesture of pure, unvarnished gratitude. He crossed the threshold and moved immediately toward the fire, his movements shaky, not just from the cold anymore, but from something deeper. He knelt on the hearth and gently lowered the child onto the worn rug, his arms trembling. The boy stirred, a tiny hand flailing weakly, and then went still. Eleanor shut the door, the heavy thud cutting off the storm's roar. The silence that rushed back in was different now. It was heavier, occupied. She didn't say another word. She turned her back on them and went to the stove, stoking the coals, adding another log to the fire. Her movements were precise, automatic. She made no offer of blankets, no offer of comfort, She didn't ask their names, but she had made space. The fire caught, climbing higher, pushing the shadows back into the corners of the room. The child whimpered again, a small, fretful sound, before quieting. Out of the corner of her eye, Eleanor watched the man. He was still kneeling, rubbing the boy's tiny frozen limbs, trying to coax the life back into them. The boy's cheeks were a waxy, unhealthy pale. His eyes were squeezed shut, his little face tight with pain. She turned away, grabbing another log from the woodpile. She didn't want to see this. She didn't want to feel the ghost of an old ache stirring in her chest. She had built her fortress to keep these exact feelings out. The cabin, which had been a tomb for one, now held three. And somewhere deep beneath the cold, hard ash of her heart, a single forgotten ember glowed, a faint and dangerous red. She didn't know it yet, but that ember was about to be stoked into a raging fire. Because the man wasn't just a stranger, and the boy wasn't just his son, and the storm they brought with them wasn't just made of wind and snow. It was a storm of secrets, and it was about to tear her world apart. The first light of dawn was a weak, watery thing, barely strong enough to pierce the gloom. Eleanor was already awake. She hadn't really slept. She had lain in her small alcove bed, listening to the two alien heartbeats in her cabin, a rhythm that disrupted the lonely symphony she had grown accustomed to. She rose without a sound, her bare feet silent on the cold wood floor. In the main room, the fire was still alive, a bed of defiant orange embers glowing in the hearth. The stranger, Luke he'd called himself, was asleep in a chair, his head slumped onto his chest. The boy Henry was curled on the rug where he'd been placed, wrapped in his father's dry coat. The sight of him, small and fragile in the firelight, stirred something in Eleanor. A memory, a pain she kept locked in a box deep inside her. She slammed the lid shut on it and turned away. She moved to the stove, her routine a comfort, a shield. She filled a pot with melted snow, set it to heat. She measured flour, salt, the last of her precious yeast. Kneading the dough was a thoughtless, automatic process. The press and fold, the rhythmic work of her hands, was a language she understood. It was a way to keep the silence from screaming. When the water boiled, she poured it into a chipped mug, adding some dried herbs. She set the steaming mug on the table next to a thick slice of yesterday's bread. It wasn't an offer of hospitality. It was a statement. Eat and then be gone. Luke stirred as if he'd sensed her thoughts. He sat up, his movement stiff, his eyes blinking in the dim light. He saw the bread and the mug, and his gaze flickered to her. He nodded once, a silent thank you that she pointedly ignored. He knelt beside the boy, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle as he checked on him. The child was still sleeping, his breathing shallow. Luke's brow furrowed with worry. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for help. He just cared. Eleanor felt that familiar tightness in her chest. She turned away, busying herself with the bread, her back to them. But she couldn't block out the sound of him murmuring to the child, his voice a low, soothing rumble. It was a sound that didn't belong here. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, she spoke. The words felt foreign in her mouth, rusty from disuse. "What's his name?" Luke looked up, surprised. It was the first question she'd asked. "Henry," he said, his voice soft. Eleanor nodded, not looking at him. She stared at the dough under her hands. She hesitated, the next words catching in her throat like burrs. "He has his mother's eyes, I imagine." It was a guess, a shot in the dark, an attempt to acknowledge the ghost that was clearly in the room with them. Luke went very still. A shadow passed over his face. "She called him Will," he said, his voice tight. I changed it. After. I wanted something new for him. She picked Henry, just before she passed. Henry James. After her grandfather." The sudden, raw intimacy of his confession hit Eleanor like a physical blow. This was what she had been trying to avoid. The sharing of pain, the trading of sorrows. She straightened up, wiping her floured hands on her apron, creating a distance between them. "He'll be warmer by the fire," she said, her voice once again flat and businesslike. She moved to the hearth and laid out another blanket, smoothing it with absent-minded care. Luke watched her, his expression unreadable. The room fell quiet again, but the silence had changed. It was filled with unspoken things now. She wanted to ask where he was from, where he was going, but she bit her tongue. The questions were dangerous. They built bridges, and she wanted only walls. The storm will break by noon, she said instead. It was a dismissal. Luke looked down at the boy, then at the faded blue scarf wrapped loosely around Henry's neck. The fabric was soft, the edges frayed. It was intricately embroidered with a pattern of tiny, silver-stitched stars. She made this for him, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He gently touched the scarf. She said she wanted him to sleep under the stars, even if we couldn't afford a roof. Eleanor's throat constricted. She looked at Henry, his little face peaceful in sleep. He had the same dimple in his chin her daughter had, the same fine, downy hair on his forehead. The pain was a physical thing, a sharp stone in her gut. She had to get them out, before this feeling, this terrible, dangerous thawing, went any further. Stay for the day, she heard herself say, the words betraying her. The bread will be ready soon. It's better warm. It wasn't an invitation. It was a surrender. A flicker of relief crossed Luke's face. He simply nodded and turned his attention back to the fire, carefully adding another small log. Eleanor went back to her dough. As she worked it, the scent of yeast filling the small cabin, she felt a profound sense of dread. The house felt fuller than it had in years. It felt inhabited. The fortress was breached, and she was beginning to suspect that the man she'd let in wasn't just a weary traveler. He was hiding something. She could feel it in the way he watched the door, in the way he never fully relaxed. She glanced over at him. He was staring into the fire, but his eyes weren't seeing the flames. They were seeing something far away, something he was running from. Then she saw it. Tucked into the top of his worn leather boot was the handle of a pistol. It wasn't the gun of a farmer or a rancher. It was a Colt Peacemaker, pearl-handled and meticulously clean. It was the gun of a man who expected trouble. Who was he? And what kind of trouble was following him through the storm? The day wore on, each hour stretching into an eternity of tense silence. The wind howled outside, a constant, mournful cry that grated on Eleanor's nerves. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft, shallow breaths of the sleeping child. Eleanor sat in her rocking chair, her knitting needles clicking together, a frantic, mindless rhythm. It was a habit, a way to keep her hands busy so they wouldn't start to shake. Luke sat on the other side of the hearth, watching Henry. The boy had grown restless in the afternoon. His cheeks were flushed, his skin hot to the touch. He whimpered in his sleep, his small limbs twitching. Luke had been dabbing his forehead with a cool, damp cloth, his movements growing more and more frantic. He kept adjusting the blankets, wrapping and unwrapping the star-stitched scarf around the boy's neck, as if the scarf itself held some kind of magic. "I think he's got a fever," Luke said, his voice tight with a fear he was trying to conceal. "He gets this way sometimes, when the cold gets in his bones." Eleanor stopped her knitting. She set the needles down with a quiet click and stood up. She moved with a purpose that came from a dark, muscle-deep memory. This was a path she had walked before. Without a word, without asking permission, she reached down for the child. Luke flinched, a protective instinct making him pull back. But then he looked at her face. He saw the grim certainty in her eyes, the practiced calm of someone who had faced this particular demon and knew its name. He hesitated, then slowly, reluctantly, he let her take his son. The heat from Henry's tiny body was a shock, a searing brand against her chest. It scorched through the layers of her wool dress, a feverish heat that felt terrifyingly familiar. She pressed her cheek to his damp hair and began to rock, a slow, swaying motion, back and forth, back and forth. And then she started to hum. It was a sound the cabin hadn't heard in 6 years, a melody that was more breath than voice, a fragile, tender thing that filled the suffocating silence. It was a ghost of a song, aching with memory. Her voice cracked on the first verse, a raw, painful break, but she didn't stop. "Hush, little sparrow, close your wings. The night will pass without sharp things." Mama's arms are strong and wide. Keep you safe until morning tide. Luke stared, his mouth slightly agape. He wasn't just stunned that this cold, silent woman was singing. He was stunned by the way she held his son, as if her arms had been empty for a lifetime, waiting for this exact wait, this specific warmth. It was a gesture of profound, heartbreaking tenderness. Eleanor looked down at the feverish boy, her expression softening in a way Luke hadn't thought possible. "He's burning up," she whispered. Luke knelt beside her, his eyes fixed on her face. His mama. She used to get fevers like this when a storm was coming on. He stopped, catching himself before he said more. There were things a man didn't say to a stranger, especially not to a woman who was singing with ghosts in her throat. Eleanor didn't press him. She just kept rocking, her voice growing stronger, the song more for herself now than for the child. No wind shall steal your dreams away. The dark won't win. It cannot stay. Sleep, my heart, so small and dear. Mama's voice is always near. As the last note faded, a strange look crossed Luke's face. It wasn't just awe, it was something else. Fear, recognition. He reached out, his hand hovering over her arm, not quite touching. "That song," he breathed, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Where did you learn that song?" Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes clouded with old pain. "My mother sang it to me," she said, her voice catching. "I sang it to my daughter." She stopped, the word daughter hanging in the air between them like a shard of glass. A heavy silence fell over the room. Henry stirred, whimpered, and then settled again, his breathing seeming to ease just a little under the steady rhythm of her rocking. Eleanor gently laid him back down on the blanket by the hearth, lingering for a moment to smooth the hair back from his hot forehead. She tucked the blue scarf a little more snugly around his neck. She stood up, her back to Luke. He was still kneeling, watching her with that same strange intensity. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Eleanor turned to face him. For the first time, the walls in her eyes crumbled. He saw the vast, barren landscape of her grief, the things she would never, ever speak aloud. "He needed warmth," she said simply, "and someone who remembers how to give it." She turned back to the fire, adding another log. But Luke's question hung in the air. It wasn't a question of gratitude. It was a question of suspicion. He had recognized the lullaby. But how? It was an old family song, passed down through generations. There was no way he could have heard it before. Unless it wasn't just her family's song. Later that night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She lay on a pallet on the floor, a few feet from where Henry slept. The lullaby echoed in her mind, and with it, Luke's question. "Where did you learn that song?" The boy's fever had broken, his breathing now deep and even. But a new kind of fever was building in Eleanor, a fever of suspicion. The storm raged on outside, but inside a different storm was gathering. The man in her cabin was not who he said he was. The pearl-handled pistol, the expensive coat, and now the lullaby. They were all pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet see. She stared into the darkness, listening to the two heartbeats that had invaded her solitude. She had let them in to save them from the storm, but now she wondered if she had just invited a much more dangerous storm inside her walls. And she had a terrible feeling that the trouble Luke was running from was about to find them both. The morning brought a fragile truce with the storm. The wind had died down to a whisper, and a pale, watery sun was trying to burn through the thick layer of cloud. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with unspoken questions. Luke was at the table, cradling a now lucid Henry in his lap, feeding him small spoonfuls of watered-down oatmeal. Eleanor moved around the room, her silence a heavy cloak. She stoked the fire, she swept the hearth, she avoided his gaze, but she could feel his eyes on her, feel the weight of the question he was too afraid to ask again. Finally, as she poured hot water into 2 mugs, he broke the silence. "She died giving birth to him." The words were dropped into the quiet room like stones into a still pond. His voice was flat, matter-of-fact, worn down to the nub. Eleanor didn't turn around. She just stirred some dried mint into the mugs and slid one across the table toward him. He took it, his fingers wrapping around the warm tin. "We had a plan," he continued, staring into the mug as if the steam held the ghosts of his past. Virginia to Montana. A new start. She packed that scarf herself. He nodded toward the blue fabric still draped over the sleeping boy. Stitched the stars in it. Said she wanted him to sleep under the sky, even if we were sleeping in a wagon. He took a shaky breath. She was good with her hands, could fix anything. A broken wheel, a torn boot, anything. Eleanor finally turned to look at him. The story was simple, tragic, and she almost believed it. But the lullaby still echoed in her ears. Just then, Henry, finished with his breakfast, squirmed out of Luke's lap. He wobbled on unsteady legs across the floor, making a beeline for Eleanor. She was bending to pick up a fallen log for the fire when she felt a tiny, insistent tug on her skirt. She froze. The touch was so light, so innocent, but it hit her with the force of a physical blow. She looked down. Henry was staring up at her, his big blue eyes wide and trusting. His little fingers were curled tightly in the fabric of her dress. He smiled, a pure, uncomplicated smile of a child who feels utterly safe. Then he reached up with his free hand and placed it gently on her cheek. Eleanor's heart seized in her chest. For a split second, the world fell away. The grief, the walls, the 6 years of frozen silence, it all melted under the impossible warmth of that tiny hand. A wave of emotion so powerful it stole her breath, washed over her. It was a scar too deep to ever forget. But for a moment it felt like it might be a wound that could heal. She knelt slowly, her eyes locked with the child's. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just let the moment happen. That night, after Luke and Henry were asleep, Eleanor sat by the dying fire, unable to rest. The boy's touch had unlocked something in her, a door she thought was rusted shut forever. She stared into the embers, her mind racing. The pieces didn't fit. The loving father who seemed so clumsy with his own child. The tragic story that felt rehearsed. And the song, always the song. Suddenly, a sound from the corner of the room jolted her from her thoughts. It was Henry whimpering in his sleep. He tossed his head back and forth on the pillow. And then he spoke a single mumbled word. A name. Will. Eleanor went rigid. Her blood ran cold. She called him Will, Luke had said. I changed it. Why? Why would a grieving father change the name his beloved, dying wife had given their son? It made no sense. Unless the story was a lie, unless the name Will was dangerous. She stood up, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her gaze fell on Luke's satchel, lying by the door. He was a deep sleeper, exhausted from the journey and the worry. Her mind screamed at her not to do it, to leave it alone, to force them out in the morning and go back to her safe, empty silence. But she couldn't. She had to know. Moving like a ghost, she crept across the room. Her hands trembled as she unbuckled the leather straps. Inside, beneath a spare shirt and a block of hardtack, was a leather-bound journal. She pulled it out, her fingers fumbling with the cover. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, elegant. It was not Luke's rough scrawl. "My dearest William," the entry began, "if you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I have failed to protect you. The man who brought you here, his name is Lucas. He is my brother. He is not your father." Eleanor gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. Her eyes flew back to the sleeping man. Lucas. Not Luke. She read on, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Your true father was a good man, a geologist named James Carter. He discovered something in these mountains, something men are willing to kill for. They murdered him for his maps, but he sent them to me before he died. The man leading them is a monster who calls himself a man of God. He is a preacher, and his name is Reverend Harlan." Eleanor felt the floor drop out from under her. Reverend Harlan? The preacher from the nearby town? The man who had buried her husband? It couldn't be. The journal continued. "Lucas is taking you to the only person I trust, a woman I never met but whose name your father spoke with reverence. Her husband was his partner, his closest friend. They died together. Her name is Eleanor Carter." The journal slipped from her nerveless fingers, and hit the floor with a soft thud. It couldn't be. James Carter was her husband's name. The child, William, Will, was her husband's son. Her husband had a son with another woman. The entire world tilted on its axis. The grief she had carried for 6 years was a lie. The man she had mourned was not the man she thought she knew. And the child sleeping by her fire, the child whose touch had just cracked open her frozen heart, was the living, breathing proof of his betrayal. A low, strangled sound escaped her throat. It was the sound of a heart breaking for the second time. And as she stared at the sleeping man and the innocent child, she realized the storm hadn't passed. It was just beginning, and it was aimed directly at her. The silence in the cabin the next morning was a living thing. It was sharp and brittle, ready to shatter at the slightest sound. Eleanor moved like a woman in a trance, her face a pale, emotionless mask. She had put the journal back, her mind a whirlwind of betrayal and confusion. Her husband, another woman, a child, a treasure, a murderous preacher. It was the stuff of nightmares. Lucas, she couldn't even think of him as Luke anymore, watched her with wary eyes. He knew something had changed. The fragile thaw between them had frozen solid again, colder and harder than before. He opened his mouth to speak several times, but her stony expression kept the words locked in his throat. She didn't know what to do. Every instinct screamed at her to throw them out, to send them back into the wilderness and let fate decide. This wasn't her fight. The boy, William. He was a symbol of her husband's deceit, a ghost she didn't want. But then she looked at him. He was sitting on the floor playing with a wooden spoon, completely oblivious to the turmoil he had brought into her home. He looked up at her and smiled, that same innocent, trusting smile. He had her husband's eyes, the same shade of deep blue. The pain was so sharp, so specific, it was like a knife twisting in an old wound. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't hear the hoofbeats until they were almost at the door. A horse, a single rider. Lucas shot to his feet, his hand instinctively going to the pistol in his boot. His eyes were wide with panic. "Who is it?" he hissed. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. Reverend Harlan. The name screamed in her mind. Had he found them? So soon? She moved to the window, peering through the frosted glass. But it wasn't the preacher. It was a man she recognized, a local hunter named Silas. A grim, quiet man who kept to himself. He stopped his horse a few yards from the cabin, his eyes scanning the area. Eleanor opened the door a crack. "Silas," she said, her voice tight. The hunter nodded, his gaze lingering on the fresh tracks in the snow. "Heard you had company," he said, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking past her, into the cabin. "Just a traveler, caught in the storm," Eleanor said, blocking the doorway with her body. Silas's eyes narrowed. "Travelers ain't the only ones out in this weather," he said grimly. He dismounted, walking closer. "Been a group of men making trouble west of the mountains. Raiders, scavengers. They hit the Morrison place 2 nights ago. Took everything. They're led by a man who doesn't fit." He paused, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "He's dressed like a preacher, wears a big silver ring on his right hand." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. It was him, Harlan. "You be careful, Eleanor," Silas said, his eyes meeting hers. "These ain't just hungry men. They're hunting for something, or someone. Don't you trust any strangers." He tipped his hat, climbed back on his horse, and rode away, leaving a thick, heavy dread hanging in the air. Eleanor closed the door, her hand trembling. She turned to face Lucas. His face was ashen. "He found us," Lucas whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know how, but he found us. We have to go," he said, scooping William up from the floor. "We have to run. Now." "Run where?" Eleanor shot back, her voice sharp. "Into another storm? With a child? He'll track you in the snow. You won't last a day." "Then what do we do?" he pleaded, desperation in his eyes. "He won't stop. He'll kill us both to get to him." Eleanor looked from the terrified man to the confused child in his arms. The boy, her husband's son. Her responsibility. Her burden, the anger and betrayal warred with a cold, clear-eyed sense of survival. Harlan wasn't just after the boy, he was after maps. Maps her husband had hidden. And if Harlan believed she was involved, he would come for her too. Lucas and the boy hadn't brought the trouble to her door. The trouble was already here, buried with her husband's secrets. Her decision was instant, forged in the cold calculus of survival. "You're not going anywhere," she said, her voice hard as steel. She walked to the fireplace and took down the long rifle that had hung there untouched for 6 years. She checked the mechanism, her movements sure and practiced. "He's not taking this child, and he's not taking this house." Lucas stared at her, stunned. The grieving, broken woman he had met 2 days ago was gone. In her place was someone else, someone with fire in her eyes and a rifle in her hands. "He thinks this is a house of ghosts," Eleanor said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "He's about to find out he's right." Just as she spoke, a sound cut through the air. A slow, deliberate knock at the door. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't Silas this time. It wasn't frantic, like Lucas's had been. It was calm, confident. The knock of a man who believes he has already won. Lucas's face went white. He clutched William tighter, backing away from the door. Eleanor raised the rifle, leveling it at the door. "Get in the back room," she ordered, her voice a low command. "And stay quiet." Lucas hesitated, then did as he was told, disappearing into the shadows of the bedroom alcove. Eleanor took a deep breath, the cold weight of the rifle a familiar comfort in her hands. The knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Eleanor?" A voice called from outside, a smooth, oily voice that dripped with false concern. "Eleanor, my child, it's Reverend Harlan. I heard you had visitors. I just came to see if you were in need of prayer." Eleanor's grip tightened on the rifle. She stood in the center of the room, a lone sentinel guarding a fortress of secrets. The preacher wanted to see if she was in need of prayer. Oh, he was about to get his answer. "Eleanor, are you in there?" Harlan's voice oozed through the thick wood of the door. "I'm worried about you, my dear. Alone out here. It's not right." Eleanor didn't move. She stood like a statue, the long rifle feeling like an extension of her own arm. She could hear Lucas in the back room, trying to soothe a whimpering William. The sound was a dangerous liability. "I'm fine, Reverend," she called out, her voice hard and steady. "I don't need any prayers today." There was a pause. She could almost picture him on the other side of the door, his face twisting from a mask of concern into a scowl of impatience. "Now, Eleanor, there's no need for that tone. The good Lord's work is never done. And there are rumors in town of a man, a child. It is my duty as your shepherd to ensure your flock is safe from wolves." "You're the wolf," she thought, her finger tightening on the trigger. "I'm quite safe," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm busy." Another pause, longer this time. She could hear the crunch of his boots in the snow as he shifted his weight. He wasn't leaving. He was testing her. He was trying to gauge what she knew. And then, the worst possible thing happened. From the back room came a child's cry. Not a whimper, but a full-throated, unmistakable wail. "William." Silence. The air outside the door went absolutely still. Eleanor's blood ran cold. It was over. He knew. The handle of the door began to turn. He was going to force his way in. But just as he did, from the back of the cabin, Lucas suddenly started singing. His voice was shaky, off-key, but it was loud. It was the lullaby. Her lullaby. "Hush, little sparrow, close your wings." Outside, the doorknob stopped turning. Harlan was listening. What was Lucas doing? Was he trying to signal something? Was he insane? Then she understood. He wasn't singing to Harlan. He was singing to her. It was a message. The journal. The truth. He was telling her that he knew she had read it, that they were in this together. A new strength surged through Eleanor. She was not alone in this fight. She walked to the door, the rifle still held at her side, hidden by her body. She drew the heavy bar back with a loud, deliberate scrape and pulled the door open just a few inches. Reverend Harlan stood on her porch, a sickly sweet smile plastered on his face. But his eyes were cold, hard chips of granite. They darted past her, trying to see into the dim interior of the cabin. She saw the big silver ring on his finger. Silas was right. "Eleanor," he said, his smile widening. "I thought I heard a child." "My cousin's boy," she lied, her voice flat. "His mother is ill. I'm watching him for a few days." Harlan's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Your cousin? I didn't know you had family left in the territory." "There's a lot you don't know, Reverend," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. His gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, down to her side. Did he see the rifle? She couldn't be sure. The singing from the back room stopped. A tense silence descended. And then William chose that exact moment to toddle out from the bedroom alcove. He stopped in the middle of the room, rubbing his eyes, a small, sleepy figure in the firelight. He looked at the stranger in the doorway. Then he looked at Eleanor. A huge, joyful smile spread across his face. "Mama!" he squealed, his voice clear and bright as a bell. He started to run toward her on his clumsy, uncertain legs. Harlan froze. His jaw went slack. The mask of the kindly preacher fell away, and for a split second, Eleanor saw the predator beneath. It wasn't shock in his eyes. It was pure, unadulterated greed. And something else. Recognition. He looked at the boy, truly looked at him, and he knew. Eleanor didn't flinch. She bent down, catching the boy as he ran into her arms. She scooped him up, holding him tight against her chest, her body a shield between him and the monster on her porch. She didn't correct him. She didn't deny it. She met Harlan's gaze over the top of the boy's head, her eyes blazing with a defiant fire. "If you came to judge, Reverend," she said, her voice dangerously quiet, "judge me for surviving, but do not question who this house protects now." Harlan stared at her, his mind clearly racing. The boy calling her Mama, the rifle she was trying to conceal. He had expected a broken widow. He had found a lioness. He slowly backed away, that oily smile returning to his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, my dear. Of course. I will pray for you. For your new family." The way he said the word family made it sound like a curse. He turned and walked back to his horse without another word. As he rode away, Eleanor watched him go, her heart pounding. She knew this wasn't over. This was a declaration of war. He hadn't been fooled. He knew the boy was in there, and he would be back, not with prayers, but with his men. She closed the door, bolting it shut. Lucas emerged from the back room, his face pale. "I'm sorry," he whispered. He started crying. "I didn't know what else to do." "You did the right thing," she cut in, her voice firm. She looked down at the child in her arms. William, her husband's son. He looked up at her, his eyes full of trust. "He knows," she said, more to herself than to Lucas. "He knows who the boy is." "What do we do?" Lucas asked, his voice filled with dread. Eleanor walked to the table and set William down gently. She looked around the small cabin. Her fortress, her tomb. It was about to become a battlefield. "First," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound purpose, "you tell me everything. Everything my husband was involved in. Everything that journal didn't say. We need to know what we're fighting for." She looked at Lucas, her eyes boring into his. "And then," she said, picking up the rifle, "we prepare for a siege." The grieving widow was gone. The woman who had buried her heart 6 years ago was dead. The person standing in her place was someone new. She was a protector, a fighter, and she was a mother. The truth came out in a torrent. As the last of the daylight bled from the sky, Lucas, or Luke as she now thought of him again, paced the cabin floor, painting a story of greed, discovery, and betrayal. Her husband James and his partner, William's grandfather, hadn't just been geologists. They had been prospectors, and they had found it. The legendary lost Spanish gold, a mother lode so rich it could make kings out of paupers. They had mapped its location, hiding the details in a complex cipher disguised as simple geological surveys. But they had made a mistake. They had trusted the wrong man. Reverend Harlan wasn't just a preacher. He was a failed prospector with a dark past, a man who had used the church as a cloak to gain the trust of the community. He had gotten wind of their discovery, and his greed was absolute. He had orchestrated their accidents. James had suspected something was wrong and had sent his half of the maps to William's mother, Sarah, Luke's sister, just days before he was killed. Harlan got his hands on the grandfather's maps, Luke explained, his voice raw with anger. But they're useless without James's half. He's been hunting my sister ever since. He caught up to us 2 weeks ago at the wagon. I was out hunting. When I got back, his voice broke. He killed her. But she'd hidden Will in the satchel. Harlan thinks the maps are on paper. He tore the wagon apart looking for them. He doesn't know the truth. The truth about what? Eleanor pressed. Luke stopped pacing and walked over to where William was sleeping by the fire. He gently touched the faded blue scarf around the boy's neck. Sarah was clever. She knew paper could be found, could be destroyed. She digitized the map. She stitched it right into the scarf. Eleanor stared at the delicate silver threads. The stars. They weren't just stars. They were a constellation, a guide. It's a star chart, she breathed. The map is a star chart. Exactly, Luke said. You align the pattern with the real stars at a certain time of year, from a certain landmark, and it points the way. Harlan has been chasing a piece of cloth, never realizing it was the treasure map he was looking for all along. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. Harlan's obsession, his relentless pursuit. It wasn't just about a child. It was about a fortune beyond imagining. And now they were trapped in a tiny cabin with the key to that fortune. A heavy silence settled over them. They were no longer just protecting a child. They were guarding a secret that had already cost 3 lives. He'll come back tonight, Eleanor said, her voice low and certain. He can't risk us getting away. He'll bring his men, and he'll burn this place to the ground to get that scarf. Luke looked at her, his eyes full of a grim respect. Then we make our stand here. The next few hours were a blur of frantic preparation. They barricaded the single window with the heavy oak table. They bolted the door and reinforced it with the iron stove poker. Eleanor found her husband's old ammunition box, thankfully still half full. She had the rifle. Luke had his Colt Peacemaker. It wasn't much against a gang of raiders, but it was something. They worked in near silence, a strange partnership forged in desperation. The man who represented her husband's greatest betrayal was now the only ally she had. The child who was a living reminder of her pain was now the only thing worth fighting for. As darkness fell completely, a profound quiet descended outside. The wind had died completely. The snow-covered landscape seemed to be holding its breath. It was the terrifying calm before a storm of violence. Eleanor sat in her rocking chair, the rifle across her lap. Luke stood by the barricaded window, peering through a small crack. William slept peacefully by the fire, blissfully unaware of the war that was about to be waged over him. I'm sorry, Eleanor, Luke said softly, his voice barely a whisper in the tense silence. For all of this. For what James did. Eleanor looked at the sleeping boy. The anger she had felt, the sharp sting of betrayal, had faded. It had been burned away by the heat of imminent danger. James was a ghost. His secrets, his lies. They belonged to the past. The boy was the future, her future. There's nothing to be sorry for, she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. He's just a child. He deserves a chance. We're going to give it to him. Luke nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes. In that moment, they weren't strangers anymore. They were partners. They were family. And then they heard it, the crunch of snow. Not one set of footsteps, a dozen. They were surrounded. Luke drew his pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked echoing loudly in the small cabin. Eleanor raised her rifle, sighting down the long barrel at the door. A voice called out from the darkness. It was Harlan. Eleanor, I've come back for my property. Send out the boy and the man and I'll let you live. I give you my word as a man of God. Eleanor let out a short, bitter laugh. Your word is worth less than the dirt on my floor, Harlan, she yelled back. Have it your way then, he screamed, his voice losing all pretense of piety. Burn it. Burn them all. A torch flared to life outside the window, casting a hellish orange glow into the cabin. They saw the silhouettes of at least 6 men, armed with rifles and torches, closing in. The first gunshot shattered the night. A bullet splintered the wood of the door, just inches from Eleanor's head. The siege had begun. The cabin erupted into a maelstrom of chaos. Gunfire exploded from all sides, bullets tearing through the thin log walls, sending splinters of wood flying like shrapnel. The roar was deafening. Eleanor dropped to the floor, crawling toward the hearth and pulling the sleeping William behind the relative safety of the stone chimney. The boy woke with a terrified scream, and she clutched him to her, shielding his body with her own, whispering the words of the old lullaby into his ear. Luke was already firing back, crouched behind the barricaded window. He was a surprisingly good shot, calm and methodical amidst the pandemonium. He fired his peacemaker, a brief pause, then another shot. A scream from outside told him he'd found his mark. "One down!" he yelled over the din. Eleanor handed William to him. "Keep him safe," she shouted, then crawled back to her position by the door. She poked the barrel of her rifle through a small crack in the logs. The night was lit by the flickering, dancing light of torches. She saw a man running toward the cabin, a lit torch in his hand, his face a mask of cruel intent. He was going to set the roof on fire. She took a deep breath, steadied her aim, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the boom echoing in the small space. Outside, the man with the torch stumbled, dropping it into the snow where it hissed and died. He crumpled to the ground and didn't move. "Two!" she screamed, a wild, fierce triumph surging through her veins. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was vengeance. For her husband, for Sarah, for the life that had been stolen from her. But they were still hopelessly outnumbered. Another torch was lit, then another. They were trying to get close enough to the walls to set the dry timber ablaze. Gunfire continued to rain down on them, pinning them in place. A bullet shattered the lantern on the mantel, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the muzzle flashes and the demonic glow of the torches outside. "They're on the roof!" Luke yelled. They could hear the heavy thud of boots on the shingles above them, the scrape of something being dragged. Harlan was getting desperate. He was going to burn them out, smoke them like rats from a hole. Panic began to set in. They were trapped. The walls that had been her fortress were now her coffin. She looked at Luke, his face grim in the flashing light. He was reloading his pistol, his hands moving with a desperate speed. He caught her eye, and in that shared glance, a silent understanding passed between them. They were going to die here, but they were going to die fighting. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos, a sound that didn't belong. A loud, sharp whistle, followed by a chorus of shouts from the woods behind the cabin. It wasn't Harlan's men. Then came a volley of rifle fire, but not aimed at the cabin. It was aimed at the attackers. Harlan's men were thrown into confusion. They stopped shooting at the cabin and started firing wildly into the trees. "Who is that?" Luke yelled. Eleanor crawled to the window, peering through the crack. In the torchlight, she saw figures emerging from the woods. It was Silas, the hunter. And he wasn't alone. He had the town marshal and a posse of at least 10 armed men with him. "Harlan!" The marshal's voice boomed across the snowy clearing. "This is Marshal Reed. Drop your weapons. You're surrounded." Harlan let out a scream of pure rage. His plan was falling apart. He had been so close. He fired his pistol wildly into the darkness, then turned to run. But Silas was faster. A single shot from his rifle echoed, and Harlan cried out, clutching his leg as he fell into the snow. His men, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve. Some threw down their guns and surrendered. Others tried to flee into the woods only to be rounded up by the posse. Within minutes, it was over. The night fell silent again, the only sounds the crackling of the dying torches and the groans of the wounded. The heavy bar on the door was lifted from the outside, and the door creaked open. Marshal Reed stood there, his face grim, his pistol still smoking. Behind him stood Silas. The marshal looked at Eleanor, then at Luke holding the crying child. He took in the bullet-riddled cabin, the barricaded window, the smell of gunpowder. He didn't need to ask what had happened. Silas stepped forward, his eyes finding Eleanor's. "I figured that preacher wasn't just worried about your soul," he said, a grim smile touching his lips. When I saw him ride out of town with that scum, I knew something was wrong. Glad we got here in time. Eleanor could only nod, a wave of relief so powerful it left her weak washing over her. She looked at Luke, who was rocking William, murmuring to him softly. She looked at her cabin, her home, battered but still standing. They had survived. Marshal Reed and his men were rounding up the prisoners, including a cursing, bleeding Reverend Harlan. The marshal walked over to the preacher, picked something up out of the snow, and held it up. It was Harlan's silver ring. "Gonna be a long time before you see the light of day, Reverend," the marshal said, his voice full of contempt. He looked over at Eleanor. "You and your family are safe now, ma'am." Family. The word hung in the cold night air. Eleanor looked at Luke, who gave her a small, exhausted smile. She looked at William, who had finally stopped crying and was staring at her with his big blue eyes, her husband's eyes. Yes, she thought, family. It wasn't the family she had planned, but it was the family she had fought for. And in the smoking ruins of her old life, a new one was just beginning. In the days that followed, the story unraveled, shocking the small community to its core. The respectable Reverend Harlan was exposed as a murderer and a thief, his gang of raiders nothing more than hired thugs. The legend of the lost Spanish gold was no longer a legend, and the quiet, reclusive widow, Eleanor Carter, became something of a local hero. The law moved slowly, but it moved surely. With the journal, Luke's testimony, and the star-stitched scarf as evidence, the courts officially recognized William James Carter as the sole heir to his father's discovery. They appointed Eleanor and Luke as his legal guardians, entrusted not only with the boy's welfare, but with the secret of the immense fortune that awaited him. The cabin, once a symbol of isolation and grief, slowly transformed. Luke, with the help of Silas and other townsfolk who now looked at Eleanor with a newfound respect, repaired the bullet holes and rebuilt the damaged roof. The woodpile grew larger than it had ever been. The hinges on the door no longer creaked. But the biggest change was inside. The silence was gone, replaced by the happy babble of a child learning to talk, the sound of Luke's off-key humming as he whittled a new toy for William, and the soft, steady rhythm of Eleanor singing her lullaby, no longer with a voice full of ghosts, but with a heart full of hope. One evening, as the first signs of spring began to melt the last of the stubborn snow, Eleanor was standing on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Luke came to stand beside her, holding a sleeping William in his arms. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the world change seasons. "I never planned to stay," Luke said quietly, not looking at her. "I was just supposed to bring him to you, make sure he was safe, and then disappear." "Why didn't you?" she asked softly. He finally turned to look at her, a small, genuine smile on his face. "I think," he said, "I was running from the same thing you were hiding from, being alone." He looked down at the boy nestled against his shoulder. "We found a home here, Eleanor. You gave us that." Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire inside. She reached out and gently brushed a stray curl from William's forehead. "You brought the life back into this house," she said. "You both did." He didn't unpack his satchel. There was no grand declaration, no formal proposal. There didn't need to be. Their future wasn't built on words or promises. It was built on something far stronger. Shared bread, a child's laughter, and the quiet, unshakable bond of three people who had survived the fire and found a family in the ashes. Later that night, Eleanor hammered a new wooden peg into the wall beside the hearth, right next to her own. She hung the blue scarf on it, its silver stars seeming to shine in the firelight. It was no longer a map to a hidden treasure of gold. It was a map of their journey, a testament to the family that had been forged in the heart of a brutal winter. A few days later, she walked to the threshold and looked down. 3 pairs of boots sat neatly on the stoop, one large and worn from a long journey, one small and scuffed from the first steps of a new life, and one that had spent years sitting alone, now part of a set. She didn't move them. She just stood there, her hand resting on the doorframe, and let the warm spring breeze blow through the open door. The fortress was gone. In its place stood a home. Out on the Montana plateau, where the world had once been erased by snow, Life was taking root again. It wasn't the life Eleanor had ever imagined for herself, but as she listened to the sound of three hearts beating steadily through the night, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that it was the life she was always meant to find. If this story reminded you that even after the longest winter, spring will always come, and that family isn't just about the blood you share, but the battles you fight together, then don't let this feeling end. Hit that subscribe button and join our posse. We've got more stories of grit, guts, and the kind of hope that can rebuild a broken heart. You won't want to miss a single one.